Christine, I'm going to paint it a little bit differently. 2007 post-election violence. I was in Eldoret. And I remember one of the gentlemen I went to school with, the house was torched, the brother was killed. And that gentleman, one thing he keeps on saying is, regardless of how much you pay me or you apologize, my brother will not come back. Our house would never come back. The history and memories would never come back. All I need is justice for a crime that was done. Let's extrapolate that to 2026. We are saying, we are sorry, we will pay you for it. But you're looking at someone who was killed at 20, at 25, just got off campus, starting their job. Who knows how bright their future was? Everything is just wiped clean. Today, when someone asks or rather demands that all we want is justice, we don't need the money, we want justice. Are they right?
They're absolutely right. Because just as Kwamchetsi has said, who must be at the center of this conversation is the victims. And if in fact the government is minded to put the victims at the center, then we would have the sequence of this whole process quite different. I think what is significant about this moment is, for many years, we have not had this public discourse. We have not had the state leading the public discourse. You, in fact, have had victims being the ones shuffling back and forth in courtrooms. You've just talked about post-election violence. We have been in court with victims of the post-election violence since then, to date. In fact, we just received a notice from the Supreme Court yesterday indicating that in one of the cases where we are now before the Supreme Court, will finally be receiving a judgment for victims of sexual violence who have been in court since February 2013. We're talking of more than a decade of waiting. Now, if we were to juxtapose that moment's conversation to now, we've reopened that debate. And what is very clear is that in the absence of truth, in the absence of justice, in the absence of guarantees of non-recurrence, then we come back to the very same point. Unfortunately, if you count down, look at the years, 2007, 2017, 2027. What do those timelines tell us?
10 years.
10 years.
10 years. We pray that we're not going to have another 27 and a similar situation. But just to continue from where Kwamchetsi left, victims who are asking for justice are rightfully asking so, because what we are lacking in the conversation around compensation now is what is the truth about what happened, right? Compensation is not something you just pick and choose. And in fact, if the government really wants to go the full hog, as we had in the statements that were made in the ceremony of receiving Ken CHR's report, then what we hope to see are mechanisms that bring out that truth. These were the circumstances of how we lost our Kenyans, our fellow citizens, these young Kenyans, and many more. These are the individuals and entities who are responsible for those violations. And these are the measures we're putting in place, not just compensation, but also mechanisms to pursue accountability. And in fact, what is very interesting, and we've seen this, the government has talked about transitional justice. The compensation panel is being led by an eminent transitional justice expert, our senior learned counsel, Professor Makal Mutua. They're fully aware of the various elements of transitional justice, right? Their hands are not tied. You know, the government wants us to believe that in fact the only measures or steps it can take that are within its control is to set up a panel and give 2 billion Kenya shillings and pay out only this specific list of victims and say the journey has begun. What have we seen in the past? there are possibilities for governments to set up special mechanisms that take into consideration that, in fact, established mechanisms such as, for instance, if we were to say the criminal justice system, IPOA, National Police Service, judiciary, and so on, may not have perhaps the capacity, the resources, the personnel, and what have you, to properly deal with investigations and prosecution of massive nature violations such as this. We've seen them world over. In the same way that the government has taken measures and steps to set up a special process and mechanism to identify and compensate victims of the Gen Z protests, they can also do so.
Yesterday,
to bring in place mechanisms that investigate and prosecute. But even more critically is the irony. You know, we're dealing now with a lack of coherence.
Yeah.
That while we're in State House receiving a report that identifies and says we are now ready to compensate in 1 week, just 2 days prior, you have goons who are politically instigated to attack. You have goons and police killing in various processes. There's a lack of coherence here. And therefore, that is what renders the question, is this a matter of political expediency, or is the government truly, genuinely committed to pursuing truth, accountability, reparation,